Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soothing, steamy, and just controversial enough to make the comment section vibrate softly while you fall asleep. Dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe pour a glass of water, room temperature, like an anxious medieval apothecary would recommend, and breathe. We're taking a slow float through the warm, occasionally perfumed, occasionally questionable waters of medieval bathing. Spoiler, people did bathe, a lot more than the memes imply. But yes, there were smells, and rules, and a surprising number of bath tokens. Let's set the vibe. Picture a European town around, say, the 14th century. It's late. The market is quiet. The church bells are done ringing. And tucked down a lane where the baker's smoke hangs in a lazy ribbon, there's a bathhouse. Its door is propped open to let out steam. Inside, a low hum of voices, a wet cedar scent, a few herbs steeping in a big tub like salad drowned in optimism. A boy in a wool cap sells little wooden markers, tokens for time in the hot pool or for a clean linen towel. You hand over a coin, because of course you do. What's the point of living in a drafty century if you can't be slightly damp and peaceful for an hour? Before we exhale into that tub, it helps to remember medieval Europe didn't appear out of nowhere. It inherited habits from Rome. Rome had public baths, private baths, bath politics, bath drama. Hypocausts, the underfloor heating systems, made spa days a civic right. After Rome's empire skidded off the highway, bath culture didn't vanish overnight. The tech was pricey, the roads got moodier, urban life shrank, but the idea of heat, water, and ritual cleaning didn't evaporate. It shifted. It got local, smaller, more practical, less marble, more wood. Monasteries kept certain habits alive, not because monks were running day spas, although give a Benedictine a ledger and he'll optimize anything. Monastic rules often limited bathing out of modesty, but they also allowed it for hospitality, sickness, and, on a schedule, the occasional we are all deeply human and also sweaty reality. Monasteries also built and maintained mills, fish ponds, and sometimes bath structures because organized people can't resist a nice system. If you're imagining robed men stepping through steam with the calm of librarians who discovered eucalyptus, you're not far off. But they'd tell you it's medicinal. For the humors, obviously. Meanwhile, in cities, bathhouses became a fixture. Not every town had a grand complex, but larger centers, Paris, London, Cologne, Prague, and plenty of smaller places had bathhouses you could find by following the pleasant fog. Some were emphatically respectable. Some went trashy after dark. Many sat along the water, for obvious plumbing reasons. They offered tubs, steam rooms, hot and cold options, and extras like oils or herbs. Think infusions of rosemary if you were feeling noble, or just hot water please if your purse had the flu. Baths weren't only for relaxation. Medicine wrapped itself around bathing like ivy on a wall. Medieval medicine lived on humoral theory, the belief that balance among blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile kept you healthy. Baths could heat, cool, moisten, or dry. Add herbs to target conditions. Aching joints, warm bath. Melancholic mood, maybe mineral waters. The physician wouldn't whisper self-care, but the prescription often looked suspiciously like it. If you wandered into a hot spring town, Aachen, Baden, Bath, and a long list of local springs, you'd find a microeconomy of hope, with attendants, guides, and people who swore the water cured their gout, their skin, and their mother-in-law's conversational persistence. And yes, soap existed. Europe used animal fats and ashes to make lye-based soaps. Southern regions had Castile soaps from olive oil. Traders passed techniques back and forth with the Islamic world where soap making and perfumery were already refined arts. If your image of a medieval person is a cartoon dust cloud with ankles, consider the linen shirt. People wore layers of linen against the skin precisely because it was washable and changed frequently. Linen acts like a gentle exfoliating cloth, catching oils and sweat. It's the quiet hero of medieval hygiene. Not glamorous, extremely effective. Like the one character in a royal household that keeps things functioning and never gets a portrait. The everyone reeked like a goat pen myth comes from later periods polemics, from moralizing sermons, from selective reading, and from the fact that cities, old and new, can smell like cities when you add animals, sewage, tanning, brewing, and a public whose deodorant game ranges from herbal sachet to let's pretend it's not there. But public bathhouses were common for centuries, enough so that authorities wrote regulations about them. That's always a tell. If the city has to regulate it, it exists in meaningful numbers. Officials worried about water supply, fire hazards, mixed bathing, and propriety. The line between bath service and services which just happen to include a bath could blur. In certain areas of London or Paris, bathhouse districts doubled as red light districts, and the church frowned in slow motion. That didn't make bathing rare. It made moralists tired. Let's float over to another warm pool and talk smell again. There were perfumes, not designer spritzes, but rosewater, orange blossom water, lavender sachets, rosemary tucked into clothing, and pomanders, little balls of aromatic stuff you could carry or hang. People washed hands and faces daily. They rinsed hair. They scraped teeth with chew sticks or used powders of salt, ash, sage, or mint. Not fluoride approved, but not nothing. If you've ever rinsed with wine because someone said it's antiseptic, congratulations, you have medieval energy. The point is, cleanliness wasn't a binary. It was a spectrum, and most people lived somewhere in the functional middle. Let's pause the steam and towel off with linen. Linen deserves a second paragraph because it quietly did more for medieval hygiene than the world gives it credit for. Everyday undergarments, the shift for women, the shirt for men, absorbed sweat and oil, and could be boiled and beaten in the wash. Laundry was labor. It took water, wood for heat, soap, beating blocks, and time, but it happened. Not daily for everyone, obviously. Daily laundry would annihilate your week. Still, a regular cycle could keep bodies and beds far fresher than the jokes assume. Imagine swapping your shirt and shift every few days, splashing face and hands morning and night, and doing a proper tub soak when time and coins allowed. You would not be the olfactory apocalypse. Let's amble back through the bathhouse door because there's gossip there. These were social spaces. People talked business, negotiated, flirted, plotted, relaxed class boundaries a little bit under the pretense of steam. Bathkeepers might charge by the hour. There could be separate hours for men and women, or mixed bathing, depending on custom and decade. With mixed bathing came predictable sermons about impropriety and predictable human nature. If you think the long medieval argument about bath morality sounds like the early internet's debate about everything, you're hearing it right. Societies recycle their worries like thrifty households. You can also picture the economics of it. Wood was expensive. Heating water for hours ate fuel. So that made a bathhouse a serious business. Cities near forests had an advantage. Places with regulated wood markets had to price carefully. You needed reliable water, reliable drains, and enough attendants to haul, scrub, and keep the temperature pleasant, rather than boiling soup with a human garnish. In some towns, bathhouses clustered near breweries because both needed hot water and fuel. Two comfort industries sharing infrastructure. Very medieval, very efficient. The stink that travelers complained about often wasn't people anyway. It was industry.
Tanners cured hides with substances we won't name before bed. Dyers used urine to fix colors. Fish markets did what fish markets do. Candlers boiled animal fat to make candles. Breweries brought yeast and warmth and a certain burp to the air. Add chamber pots, open drains, and rain doing its best as a part-time sanitation worker. Urban smellscapes came from the work of the town. People were parts of it, sure, but the chorus was civic. Let's slide past the curtain to the changing room and mention something delicate: the medieval bathhouse's reputation. In some places, over some decades, public baths developed a racy side hustle. Regulations in London's Southwark stews and ordinances in Paris and German towns suggest that sex work and bathing were close neighbors. Authorities oscillated between tolerating, regulating, and cracking down, depending on plague scares, moral.
Hey again. Keep the lights low, keep the breathing slow. Let the room be as warm as a bread oven at dawn, but less flammable. We're still drifting in the tub, just sliding one finger along the surface of the water like a bored saint contemplating a minor sin. Tonight we wade a little deeper into particular cities, real ordinances, famous springs, and the very human problem of eating too close to water. Because yes, someone always thinks a honey cake is enhanced by steam, and then gravity votes. Let's begin in Paris, where the Seine moves like a long gray ribbon and the city always has opinions. Bathhouses were part of Parisian life for centuries, enough that officials kept writing rules as if parchment could correct human nature. Picture timbered buildings, a sign with a tub painted on it, and a doorway breathing steam. There's a keeper at a table with a box of wooden tokens. You pay for time, sometimes for a private stall, sometimes for shared pools. There's a posted hour for men, a posted hour for women, another hour everyone pretends not to notice. The rules try to keep the categories clean, the conversations polite, and the water devoid of floating bakery products. Results vary. The best tell that baths were normal is how boring the regulations can be. No fighting, no gambling, no bringing weapons into the hot room. Apparently this needed saying, which says everything about medieval confidence in steel. No sex work on the premises, according to moralists, which means there was sex work very near the premises, according to observable reality. If you've ever worked in a place with a staff room sign that says, "Please clean up after yourself," you know the genre. The sign exists because the request fails. Slide north and a bit west to London, and you'll hit the Southwark stews. The word sounds cozy. It was not soup. It was a cluster of bathhouses on the South Bank, across the bridge far enough from the city to acquire a personality the city could plausibly disown when the bishop visited. The stews offered hot water, clean towels, and services that don't get explained in bedtime scripts. Authorities periodically cracked down, then commerce exhaled again. This on-off moral metronome lasted for centuries, taking through plague scares, sermons, and the mundane schedule of "we open at 10. If you ever imagined the Middle Ages as a monochrome scold, Southwark walks in wearing a towel and a smirk. Now drift east along the Rhine to Cologne, where merchants counted coin by candle, and the cathedral became a very long-term project. Urban baths here functioned like a civic heartbeat. Fuel was expensive, water needed managing. That meant the city watched bathkeepers the way it watched millers and butchers. You regulate what matters. You don't waste ink on fantasies. In winter, a bathhouse could feel like a public good. Warmth, cleanliness, conversation, and a brew vacation from wind. The town smelled like a town. Yeast from breweries, hides near tanners, a hint of smoke in every cloak. The bath wasn't a luxury so much as a reset button. One evening of steam and the world looked a little less like February. Let's turn our head toward Prague, a river city that liked to glitter when it could. Watermills lined the Vltava, bathhouses tucked into neighborhoods like cozy rumors. There's a comfortable rhythm in the sources, rules about hours, complaints about mixed bathing, and municipal attention to fire risk. That last point matters. Heating water for hours means big stoves, big stoves in timbered neighborhoods is drama waiting to happen. Fire ordinances haunt every warm corner of the medieval city. If you ever wondered why bath tokens cost what they cost, add a line item called "Try not to burn down half the district." We'll travel off long enough to walk, slowly, to the famous spring towns. The water here is not regular water. It comes up hot, mineral-laden, and faintly proud of itself. People call them healing springs long before anyone gets picky about calcium content. Aachen, Baden, Carlo Vivari, and in England, the city named so bluntly you can't forget the agenda: Bath. You don't need a miracle to enjoy them. You just need sore knees or a physician with a humoral chart and a pen that leaks optimism. The experience is social medicine. You travel, you rent a room, you wake up early, shuffle to the pool, descend into warmth with a face that says, "I am open to being less cranky." Attendants fuss, relatives encourage, the town sells you pastries that pretend to be medicinal. You leave after 2 weeks absolutely convinced something has improved. Maybe it has, maybe the water did a thing, maybe time off work did more. Either way, you tell everyone at home. The town smiles and keeps the shutters freshly painted. These spring towns incubate an entire microculture: bath etiquette, bath inns, bath musicians, bath physicians with their lecture voice set to calm certainty, and bath vendors hawking herbal packets the way modern cafes hawk wellness shots. People add rosemary, mint, bay, and thyme to their tubs like making soup for their skeletons. If you're imagining a brochure that says, "Our waters are recommended for melancholy, firmness of joints, slow appetites, overactive appetites, and that general feeling of being alive in November," you're in the right steam cloud. Let's float north where the winters bite and the solutions bite back. Saunas and steam rooms are not medieval Europe's rumor. They're a habit. In Scandinavia, the sauna becomes a room for cleansing, childbirth, curing meat, telling stories, and taking the edge off a climate that enjoys a good mood swing. The ritual is simple: heat, sweat, wash, often a plunge in cold water. Birch twigs for gentle whipping, which sounds aggressive and is weirdly the opposite. In Slavic villages, the banya plays a similar role: family, neighbors, warmth, and the kind of evening that ends with quiet satisfaction and early sleep. It's not luxury. It's survival with benefits. Back to cities and a slower heartbeat. How often did medieval people bathe? The accountant's answer is, it depends. On season, on money, on fuel, on your job, on your town's water supply, on whether the bathhouse is open because the magistrates are in a scandal-averse mood, on whether plague notices are pinned outside the church, making everyone suspicious of open pores. Weekly is feasible for a lot of urban folk in good years. Fortnightly for many. Daily? Unlikely, unless you live at the bath, work there, or belong to a household with servants and a cheerful fire budget. But hands and face, morning and evening, very common. Rinsing feet after work? Soothing and normal. Changing linen shirts and shifts? Routine if you own enough. And your laundry day hasn't been rained on for a week straight. The laundry riverbank is its own theater. Washerwomen beat linen on boards and stones, trade news, and build forearms that could shame a knight. Soap is harsh, water is cold. Steam from vats marks the houses of professional laundresses like little weather systems. The work is loud and rhythmic. The white linen dries on lines like soft flags asserting civilization. If you judge cleanliness purely by tub frequency, you miss the daily maintenance. If you include linen as a skin, the scorecard looks much better. Now, health theory drifts back like a cautious cat. The humors dominate medical writing, but the practice on the ground is very practical. Warm a stiff back, cool a fevered brow, add chamomile for comfort, add vinegar if you're worried about contagion. Wipe down with scented cloths when a physician says hot water opens pores to bad air. Keep your head covered after bathing so wind does not enter. It sounds quaint until you remember your grandma also told you not to go out with wet hair and she wasn't reading Galen. There's a sensible core in the superstition: avoid temperature shock, rest after heat,
Don't lick the public ladle. That one's modern, but spiritually correct. Monasteries deserve another quiet paragraph. They set rhythms. Rulebooks like the Regula Benedictine talk about modesty, necessity, and care for the sick. Monastic infirmaries had bathing facilities not for pleasure, but for treatment. The line between healing bath and nice bath is thin, and monks are human. They also brewed ale, mastered fish farming, copied books, and built the kind of water systems that make a bath possible in the first place. If you want a reliable hot tub, befriend the order with the best plumbing. Let's turn to smell again with the volume dialed to faint. Perfumed waters are common among the better off. Rose, violet, lavender, and orange blossom get distilled into little flasks that live in your combs and mirrors. Pomanders, metal or carved balls holding aromatics, hang from belts like portable hope. Sachets slide into chests and canopies. Wool cloaks pick up everything they pass through. Linen resist. You learn which pieces of clothing hold the day, and you launder accordingly. You also learn to eat away from the tub, officially. Unofficially, there's always that one person with almonds. The attendant sighs, fetches a skimmer, and performs the quiet, eternal ceremony of removing snacks from communal water. Every bathkeeper in every century has done this. This is how you know we share a species with the past. We are soft, warm, and occasionally very bad at boundaries. Let's close tonight with one more slow walk through time. Imagine the bathhouse at twilight. The last customers are drowsy. The big stove gulps wood one last time before settling. The keeper counts tokens and coins with wet fingers and a mental note about ordering more towels.
Welcome back, fellow travelers, to another evening of the past wrapped in steam and dry humor. The air is still warm, the candlelight is gently flickering, and I hope you've managed to make yourself cozy. Tonight, we're drifting past medieval bathhouses into the world of royals and their peculiar, often misguided, and occasionally elaborate bathing habits. I'd offer you a cup of hot water with a sprig of rosemary, but instead we'll settle into something equally warm. The fascinating, sometimes hilarious, often strange, but very real world of royal beauty regimens. Let's begin with the royal bath. Yes, that's right. Even the most exalted among us weren't exempt from the occasionally stinky business of personal hygiene, though they certainly tried their best to make it look graceful. Picture it, a 12th century king sitting in a large gold-lined tub, which, let's face it, was probably a bit of a show-off moment more than a real moment of cleanliness. The room would be filled with attendants, servants, and probably a few nervous nobles, all waiting to witness the great and powerful monarch indulge in the humdrum act of bathing. For the royalty of the day, bathing wasn't just about getting clean. It was about making a statement, about showing that they could afford all the finest soaps and oils, and that their wealth could buy them the most exclusive baths in the land. But let's be clear here. While they may have been pampered in a way we can't even imagine today, medieval royalty still had to face the harsh realities of medieval hygiene. Imagine being the heir to a throne, accustomed to the finest linens and velvet, and yet you can't escape the occasional problem of body odor, head lice, or the fact that your teeth are basically just tiny, unflattering pebbles in your mouth. You'd think that all that royal privilege would come with a personal bath every morning, right? Well, yes and no. Let's turn our attention to King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, the man who is practically a walking, living, breathing symbol of opulence and extravagance in the 17th century. Louis, of course, did not enjoy the same sort of bathhouse experiences as the average peasant. His personal hygiene was a bit more involved. Rather than soaking in a public tub with the common folk, he had his own private space, and his bathing routine became a spectacle in itself. The royal court was obsessed with cleanliness, sure, but it wasn't because Louis liked to get too clean. He was, after all, rather keen on his own personal scent. But his process of bathing was long, drawn out, and frankly excessive. In fact, Bathing as a concept was becoming a bit more choreographed by the time Louis came around. In his court, a bath wasn't simply a splash in water to scrub away the day's dirt. It became an entire event. He would bathe, but it wasn't the soak and scrub method we associate with modern-day pampering. Instead, there was a series of rituals that often involved aromatic oils, lotions, and perfumes. But here's the kicker. Louis wasn't really bathing to be clean. No. He was bathing to keep up appearances and engage in the most superficial of royal displays. His attendants didn't just bathe him, they massaged his body with oils, lathered his hair with special concoctions to keep it soft and shiny, and, importantly, to disguise any lingering smells. And oh, the perfumes. Louis wore so much that his scent was, quite literally, a trademark. The man was a walking potpourri. But let's talk about how different this was from earlier European monarchs. Before the glory days of Louis XIV, bathing was, well, a little less glamorous. In fact, early medieval monarchs didn't bathe all that often, at least not in the way we think about it today. Bathing was considered, in some ways, a bit too indulgent, even sinful. According to some medieval churchmen, bathing was a form of bodily excess, a possible temptation of the flesh. Can you imagine a king's personal hygiene questioned by an abbot? But it's true. The church had a long history of disapproving of baths. They argued that getting too comfortable with hot water might encourage people to get too comfortable with, well, not so pious behavior. And so many medieval monarchs followed the rules. They didn't bathe as regularly as we might expect. There are records of kings, queens, and nobles being bathed only once or twice a year, even though they were surrounded by all the wealth and resources to live in luxurious, hygiene-friendly conditions. The truth is, medieval kings and queens didn't always know how to handle their personal hygiene. They had their moments of cleanliness, like using perfumes, oils, and powders, but their baths were hardly a spa day. You are more likely to see them dipping a cloth in warm water to wipe their faces and hands than to imagine them soaking in a giant copper tub. In the royal courts of the Middle Ages, perfumes were a crucial accessory to any king or queen's wardrobe. As we've mentioned, the air didn't always smell so sweet in the days before industrial plumbing. Bathing wasn't as often as we think, and in its place, royals used perfumes, oils, and incense to keep things from smelling quite as, shall we say, authentically medieval. Of course, the use of scent wasn't just about cleanliness, it was also about power. A queen who could afford rosewater and expensive scented oils was declaring, "I am of the highest rank, and I have access to the finest things." A king who wore a certain fragrance was announcing his dominance and opulence. These perfumes became symbols of wealth, much like the clothes they wore. But perfumes and oils aside, let's talk about what really made royalty's grooming habits so high maintenance. It was all about those strange and sometimes over-the-top regimens. For instance, the hair treatments were elaborate. Kings and queens had elaborate hairstyles, some of which involved, quite literally, the use of powdered gold dust. You heard that right. They dusted their hair with gold powder, not because they were afraid of a bad hair day, but because they could, because wealth meant glittering. And yet, in the face of all this excess, one could argue that it didn't really help. After all, when you're spending your days steeped in perfumes, powders, and oils, how much of it is truly for personal cleanliness, and how much of it is simply for appearances? The constant drive to maintain a perfectly royal look left many of these monarchs with skin that was pale and sickly, and hair that was perpetually in need of maintenance. In fact, some historical records suggest that these royal regimens caused more problems than they solved. The oils used for bathing often caused breakouts, and the perfumes could irritate the skin. Let's talk about royal teeth while we're at it. You might be imagining that the nobility had pristine, pearl-white teeth. Unfortunately, that's a bit too much of a fairy tale. In reality, medieval royals had issues with dental hygiene much like everyone else of their time. But being royal had its advantages. Some kings and queens had access to the finest herbal remedies that supposedly helped with teeth whitening. Think crushed mint and salt. But more often than not, they had to make do with rudimentary tools like toothpicks and mouthwashes made from vinegar. And those who didn't have access to such luxuries, well, let's just say royal smiles weren't always as dazzling as the crowns. There's a fascinating irony in all of this. The people who could afford the best perfumes, oils, and cosmetics were often the people who looked the least natural. They were overcompensating for what we'd now call modern hygiene. Essentially, they were trying to prove they didn't smell like peasants by constantly masking themselves in artificial scents. But no matter how much oil or perfume they doused themselves in, they couldn't completely escape the realities of medieval living. Dirt, disease, and death were never far away. Even the wealthiest kings couldn't avoid the fact that they still lived in a world that had only just begun to understand the importance of proper hygiene. And as we drift deeper into this bathhouse of royal courts, let's remember this. The next time you hear about medieval kings and queens, don't imagine them in shining white robes, pristine and odor-free. Picture them in the sweat, oils, and perfumes of their time, doing their best, but still somehow incredibly human. Not so different from us, really. After all, it was the 15th century. They were living the medieval equivalent of a luxury skincare routine, hoping for results, but maybe just creating a lot of smells and stains. Next time, we'll float over to the Renaissance and explore even more eccentricities of royal hygiene. And who knows, maybe we'll also discuss the modern world's obsession with ancient beauty secrets. Spoiler, they don't all age well. Until then, let's let the steam settle, tuck in, and feel free to remember that in the grand scheme of things, we are probably way cleaner than they were. At least until you have that one extra slice of cake tomorrow.
The Renaissance, a time of rebirth, of cultural flourishing, and, believe it or not, a time when the concept of hygiene was slowly starting to take shape in ways that wouldn't be entirely foreign to us today. But of course, this was also the age of powdered wigs, massive plumes, and some truly ridiculous notions of beauty. So while some things were moving forward, others were taking one step forward and two steps back, as you'll soon see. So, let's slide into the 15th and 16th centuries, where the air was thick with perfumes and the pursuit of beauty was all-consuming. You might think this was a time of enlightenment, when people really began to embrace cleanliness and self-care. And while that's partially true, we're still very much talking about a time where nobility had to balance cleanliness with image. At times, their pursuit of purity was ironically more about appearance than actual health. Let's begin with the royal court, where all of this steam, oil, and beauty rituals were reaching their peak. Take, for example, the famous Italian court of Florence. Florence, as we know, was a hub for art, culture, and political power, but it was also a place where looking good could be a matter of life or death. Figuratively, of course. The Medici family in particular were experts at blending wealth and vanity. When we think of their royal court, we often imagine beautifully painted portraits, sculpted marble statues, and fashionable attire. But let's not forget that behind all those glittering gowns and fine silks were some rather questionable hygiene practices. In Florence, like many other places in Renaissance Europe, people weren't exactly hopping into tubs every day. Bathing was still seen as a bit of a luxury, reserved for those who could afford the time and resources to indulge in it. Bathhouses existed, sure, but they weren't as widespread or regularly visited as you might think. Wealthy Florence was a city that took pride in its perfumes, scented oils, and elaborate beauty regimens. And why not? If you had the means, it was a lot easier to splash on Rosewater than take a proper bath. Enter the wondrous world of Renaissance beauty secrets. Royalty and the upper crust were obsessed with being pale, and pale meant not bathing as much. Yes, that's right. If you were looking to achieve the ideal fair complexion that was all the rage, frequent bathing was to be avoided. This wasn't just a preference, it was practically a rule.
The idea was that you were too busy being royal to concern yourself with anything as pedestrian as cleanliness. So pale skin was prized, and pale skin was achieved by keeping your face and body as clean as possible without actually getting rid of the grime. And what better way to maintain that porcelain glow than by a little powder here, a dab of rosewater there, and of course a healthy dose of smelly perfumes to cover up the natural body odors. But don't be fooled. Just because they weren't bathing every day didn't mean they weren't aware of how to keep the illusion of cleanliness. Royalty had access to the finest cosmetic products, which included everything from scented oils and powders to odd mixtures of animal fat and herbs. For instance, Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most famous monarchs of the Renaissance, was renowned for her beauty, though whether or not it was truly her beauty or just the effect of her heavy layer of white lead-based makeup is a matter for the historians. Her face was famously covered in white powder, a look designed to give her that perfect porcelain look. But as you may have guessed, lead isn't exactly a substance that helps with hygiene. So while Elizabeth may have been clean in appearance, her actual hygiene practices were, well, let's say they were more about surface-level presentation than actual cleanliness. She bathed less frequently than we'd like to think. And like most of her contemporaries, she relied on the grace of perfumes to keep the scent of her body from offending anyone too much. And if her scent didn't quite do the trick, she could always count on the fragrance of her clothing. Padded, scented undergarments were in high demand. Every inch of her skin was covered in layers of fabric that absorbed both body odor and perfume, thus creating a permanent veil of scent around her. But let's not just focus on Elizabeth. I'm sure we can all agree that her beauty was an acquired taste. Other royals were no different. King Henry VIII, infamous for his health issues, had a similar, though much less graceful relationship with cleanliness. Henry, notorious for his indulgent lifestyle, had a less than stellar track record when it came to hygiene. Despite his prodigious wealth, he wasn't exactly known for his daily baths. In fact, Henry VIII had the habit of changing his linen every day, but not because he was concerned with cleanliness. No. His clothes were changed because he had a deep love affair with food and drink. And as any medieval person would tell you, food and drink didn't always agree with his digestive system. So as a result, Henry's linens were frequently soiled, and he needed fresh ones daily, which on one hand is better than never changing at all, but on the other hand, let's not forget that it doesn't exactly scream hygienic. But for all the absurdities of royal bathing, it wasn't just the elites who were avoiding the tub. Even in the Renaissance, most common people were still not indulging in daily baths. The harsh reality was that water was still scarce in many parts of Europe. Bathhouses were often seen as potentially risky environments. After all, who knew what might be lurking in that water? Medieval and Renaissance doctors still subscribed to the idea that hot water opened the pores, making the body more susceptible to disease. And even if you did take a bath, you might find that the water wasn't exactly crystal clear. Public bathhouses, after all, were notorious for being unsanitary. It wasn't uncommon for people to contract diseases from communal bathwater. So while bathing might be a social thing, it wasn't exactly a health benefit for the average person. And while the royalty doused themselves in perfumes and lotions, the common folk, well, they relied on less glamorous but still somewhat effective methods of cleaning. A quick rinse with whatever water was available, a scrub with a cloth, or the occasional herbal rinse if they were lucky. These were the norms for most people. If they were lucky enough to live near a river, they might take a dip in it. But for the most part, public bathhouses were the main social spots where anyone could get a little bit of hot water and maybe talk to a neighbor while trying to avoid getting too close to the stranger in the next tub over. There were also alternative methods that people swore by, like using fragrant herbs, ashes, and even certain plants for body and hair care. Hair was especially tricky. Many royals and commoners alike dealt with lice, so various herbal concoctions were employed to make the scalp less hospitable to those tiny invaders. Lavender, rosemary, and thyme were all used to soothe the scalp, while nettles were sometimes used to make a hair tonic. This wasn't exactly the glamorous hair treatment we think of today, but it was effective, at least to some extent.
Now let's touch on the fascinating world of Renaissance dental hygiene. Yes, royal teeth were not always the picture of perfect health. While we've already touched on the medieval obsession with cleanliness, or lack thereof, the Renaissance was really the time when things started to get a little, well, strange. For starters, the wealthy still didn't quite know how to care for their teeth. They relied on basic powders made from things like salt, ashes, or even burnt bread, rubbed directly onto their teeth. Not exactly the whitening toothpaste you'll find on your shelf today, but it worked in a pinch, at least when you aren't chewing on something sticky. But there were, of course, more extravagant methods. King Henry VIII, for example, was said to have had a particular fondness for sugar, one of the more unpleasant legacies of the Renaissance. Sugary foods weren't just a treat, they were status symbols. The more sugar you could afford, the better. And what does sugar do to teeth? Well, it doesn't make them stronger, that's for sure. And while we don't have clear records of Henry's dental practices, the king's teeth were notoriously bad, contributing to some of the health problems he faced later in life. Let's just say royal teeth weren't all they were cracked up to be. And with all that, here we are gliding gently out of the Renaissance, where the crown of perfumes, powdered wigs, and elaborate beauty regimens was firmly in place. The monarchy may have looked pristine on the outside, but behind the wigs, the fragrances, and the heavy layers of linen, things weren't as clean as they appeared. While the courts of Europe spent their time and money masking the reality of medieval hygiene with the best perfumes money could buy, the rest of Europe was still figuring out how to wash up without overcomplicating it. So, what have we learned, my dear bedtime history aficionados? The truth is, we've always been a little obsessed with our own cleanliness, and at times, that obsession has been more about image than hygiene. Royalty, with their scented oils and powdered faces, were no exception. Sure, they had access to luxuries we can't even dream of today, but they also had the same human foibles we do. We might wash more often than they did, but they managed to find ways to appear clean even when they weren't. And now, as we settle into sleep and the gentle steam of the past drifts away, remember this: cleanliness is next to godliness, but it's also often next to vanity, and that, my friends, is one of the oldest truths in history. Sweet dreams.